8. Decadence now, the bucket auger chewed deep into the ground. A 3-foot wide steel cylinder, with 3-inch jagged teeth bristling from its business end. The bucket part of the bucket auger is a yawning, spinning maw that grinds through earth as if it were made of marshmallow. Mounted on a telescoping pole, it's capable of burrowing 100 feet down, then retracting and bringing up huge chunks of whatever lies beneath, bucketful by bucketful. A whirling sand toy on steroids. The bucket auger's torque is so powerful that it has chewed right through a wrecked and buried car, engine block and all. Pulled up and upended with a hiss of hydraulics and grinding of gears, the bucket disgorged a blend of dirt and plastic and old newspapers, many of them yellow and brittle, but surprisingly readable. There were cans, yard clippings, and several hot dogs, a bit dingy but intact, the queasy power of preservatives at work, perhaps. And there was a white ceramic bowl of some brown stuff, which, when its dirty crust was scraped away, revealed something bright green inside. There were chunks of something still visible in the mix. "Hey, I think it's guacamole!" Archaeologist Bill Rathy shouted to his crew of student volunteers, dabbing his finger in the stuff. It was guacamole. The chunks were avocado slices, still green, and the nearby newspapers allowed the perishable treat's age to be inferred, 25 years. The guacamole had last seen daylight a quarter century ago, and yet, while not exactly edible, it seemed fresher in appearance than it would have looked after just a few days sitting in Rathi's kitchen sink. It had been preserved, unintentionally, and, to all but Rathi and his crew, unexpectedly. Because that's not how landfills were supposed to work. Or so it was said. The bucket auger is a tool for drilling wells, for water and oil, but it's also how Rathji, founder of the Garbage Project, spent decades exploring the inner space of landfills, about which many knowing assumptions have been made over the years, and which Rathji time and again proved mistaken. He is the world's first garbologist, and his work uncovered just how poor an understanding we have of our own waste. Most people don't really know their trash, says Rathji, a broad, deep-voiced archaeologist who has been labeled the Indiana Jones of refuse. But through their trash, we sure do know a lot about them. The idea for a garbage project, for a systematic and unprecedented deep analysis of modern waste using the same skills, tools, and modes of inquiry archaeologists employ to understand the ancient world, began with a simple student project and training exercise in the early 70s at the University of Arizona in Tucson. Rathji, a Harvard University-educated archaeologist who specialized in the study of ancient Mayan ruins, was then a young professor on the Tucson campus, long a hotbed of archaeological discovery due to the wealth of ancient Native American sites throughout the region. He wanted to introduce basic archaeological methods to the students in his anthropology class through a series of independent study projects. Two of the students came up with the idea of fact-checking some typical cultural stereotypes with physical reality, which they proposed to accomplish by comparing the real-world trash collected from 2 homes in an affluent area of Tucson with the trash from 2 homes in a poor part of town. Would the 2 sets of families differ in unexpected ways, or would they be unexpectedly similar? Would the real-world detritus produced by the test subjects, their identities protected by the archaeologist's dusty equivalent of doctor-patient confidentiality, confirm cultural cliches or shatter them? This idea appealed to Rathji on a number of levels. For one thing, he's a natural contrarian, so the idea of using trash to upturn stereotypes and commonly held assumptions was beyond delicious. Cut the crap and bullshit are favorite expressions of his, reserved for what he considers to be galling misstatements about garbage by the uninitiated. Over the years, he has been particularly incensed by persistent claims and extensive media coverage of the supposed evils of disposable diapers, which he says create barely a blip in the average landfill, while distracting the public from genuine and larger garbage problems, such as the proliferation of phone books, most of which are unwanted and, to this day, mostly get landfilled instead of recycled. The other thing Rathji liked about the student garbage study was its embrace of the gritty realities of genuine archaeology, which, for all its seeming romance, its air of exotic locales and lost civilizations, really boils down to rooting around in dead people's trash. Really, really old trash, certainly, long stripped of its smells and general ickiness, but trash just the same, the true object of archaeologist lust because it represents the unvarnished story. The monuments, stone tablets, formal histories, and burial chambers that describe the glories of dead civilizations are all well and good, but they tell the story the kings and scholars wish to communicate. the idealized version, the version that the victors in a war get to tell, rather than these stories of the conquered. In garbage, though, there are no half-truths, no spin, no politics. Conquerors may plunder the riches and thereby the historical record, but no one plunders trash. The accrual of what a people ate will be there, master and slave, worker and lord alike, an honest tale of crusts, rinds, bones, and seeds, how they lived, what they wore, where their trade routes reached, even how and who they worshipped. All of that, and so much more, is contained in the record of their garbage, the unbiased arbiter and keeper of the inner life of any civilization. What we say about ourselves, observes Rathje, is never as honest or as revealing as what we throw away. This is why archaeologists crave trash, why Washington's outhouse at Valley Forge was a major dig. The general and future president threw all kinds of things in there, then trash, now illuminating artifacts, and why it was not such a stretch for a professor of ancient Mayan culture to approve his students' plans to look for similar truths in Tucson's trash. Based on the garbage recovered, the two students concluded that, income and conventional wisdom notwithstanding, the two sets of families consumed similar amounts of steak, hamburger, and milk. The poor families, however, bought more household cleansers and spent more on goods related to child education. As fascinating as these differences were, the tiny sample size made it impossible to draw any sweeping conclusions. But it did suggest a new, potentially fruitful subject of study, using trash to gauge all sorts of contemporary behaviors, and to see if that trash trail squared with our societal assumptions, or revealed the myths we live by. This was new territory. Detectives and journalists had been known to root through garbage from time to time, looking for stories and scandals in those pre-paper shredder days. But a scientific inquiry into the patterns and context of trash as real-time cultural artifacts, evidence of consumer behavior and window onto society's soul, had never been attempted in any sustained way. During World War II, the Army tasked a pair of enlisted men with marketing experience to gauge soldiers' satisfaction, or lack thereof, with military mess by analyzing the food that was thrown away by mess halls. The results: too much food was being prepared in mess tents throughout the Army. Staggered mess calls resulted in more clean plates than single long lines that allowed the food to get cold for many soldiers. Most of the soup, kale and spinach got trashed, and there was no such thing as too much ice cream. Menus and meal preparation were soon adjusted, less spinach and kale, and the Army began saving 2.5 million pounds of wasted food a day. The first modern practical benefits of the study of garbage, or, as it has come to be known, garbology. Despite the rousing success, the Army discontinued its study of food waste and garbage in general, and the thread wouldn't be picked up again until Rathje spotted the opportunity 3 decades later in Tucson. We were, Rathje recalls, apologizing with unconvincing sincerity for the pun, breaking new ground. In 1973, Rathje, several of his colleagues and his students expanded the garbage study concept and the amount of trash to be analyzed, and the Garbage Project was born. The conceit was simple. If we use the same archaeological tools and techniques previously employed on Egyptian pyramids, lava, encrusted Pompeii, and the painted caves of Lascaux, what can we learn about American civilization from its garbage? What is the secret story of trash? The archaeological team did not go out on digs at the beginning. Instead, the artifacts were delivered to the Garbage Project, which is to say the university arranged to have. The city sanitation department dumped piles of garbage from specific census tracts on a campus maintenance yard 6 days a week. Then Rathje and his team of student volunteers surveyed and cataloged the mess, wearing rubber gloves, surgical masks, and gowns, bagging and tagging the garbage on sorting tables, trying to figure out how to categorize a marshmallow. Answer: as candy. Before they could figure out what it all meant, though, they had to develop from scratch an entirely new language of trash. They went so far as to create a sort of Rosetta Stone of aluminum can pull tabs. This was back in the day when the tabs were designed to detach from beverage cans. It turned out there was a surprising variety in these little bits of metal that could identify beverage type, age, and manufacturer simply by the shape and heft of the tab. And the Garbage Project remains to this day the one and only forensic authority on the subject. Meanwhile, an entire numbering system evolved over time to catalog the rest of the garbage. 001 was beef, 003 was chicken, the Garbage Project's nemesis, for nothing smelled worse than rancid uncooked chicken. 090 was powdered baby formula. 139 was a plastic container. 149 was auto supplies. There were 190 separate codes in all. After the garbage was categorized, counted, and compared, the unexpected and counterintuitive findings began almost immediately. First, there was the matter of food waste, a major component of everyday trash. Food waste was rampant, though that wasn't news. What was surprising was that the amount of waste seemed to rise during times of shortages and high costs. This was particularly easy to spot when it came to meat, which gets trashed with unusually good documentation along for the ride. The meat packaging used at markets includes the type of meat, its cost, its packaging date, and its weight. Comparing that to the actual meat discarded in the same batches of trash provides a reasonably accurate measurement of carnivorous food waste. In that first year of the garbage project, a blight decimated feed crops, which drove up the cost of raising beef cattle, which in turn caused a sharp and well-publicized increase in the cost of red meat to consumers. In some areas, there was a shortage of popular cuts of beef, amid a great deal of media coverage about the turmoil in the beef cattle industry. Common sense might suggest that such scarcity, high cost, and feverish press would lead to a reduction in food waste, as families sought to stretch their food dollars and get every meal they could from each costly purchase. But the opposite was true. Beef waste, during normal times, hovered around 3%, the Garbage Project volunteers found. But during the shortage months, wastage tripled to 9%. Ratche eventually hit on the explanation for this counterintuitive behavior. When shortages occurred or were even discussed in the news media, consumers purchased more beef than normal. As hoarding exhausted supplies, they also tended to purchase cuts of meat that they normally did not buy, and that they did not necessarily know how to prepare well. The combination of overbuying and bad cooking led to extra waste, with more raw, spoiled meat and more uneaten and apparently unappetizing cooked meat showing up in the trash than was the case during normal market conditions. Consumers, when asked, thought they were being sensible and economical. When their trash told a different truth, they were being more wasteful than ever. In a similar vein, the Garbage Project discovered that well-publicized special collection days that sanitation departments set for collecting hazardous household waste, varnishes, paints, cleaning compounds, old motor oil, oven cleaners, and other nasty chemicals that are not supposed to go in ordinary landfills, yet often do, had the unintended effect of leading to more rather than less improper disposal of toxics. City sanitation departments have in modern times labored to keep these toxic home products out of regular garbage landfills because of the environmental hazards they pose, which is why special collection days and locations are set for them. The Garbage Project analysts who wanted to examine the effect of these toxic collection days found that on the day after these special hazardous waste pickups, the regular trash stream had twice as much hazardous waste improperly tucked inside it as normal. The explanation was simple enough. Alerted by the publicity about the hazards of such materials, people rounded up all those nasty cans and bottles of sludge and dried paint that had sat forgotten, gathering dust in their garages, cellars, and sheds. Then, for one reason or another, they had missed the special collection time. Chagrined, but also motivated by the publicity to get rid of the stuff, they had just tossed it in their regular trash bins and covered it with orange peels and plastic debris. Once again, the Garbage Project had shown that a well-meaning trash policy based on assumptions about human behavior had generated the opposite result as was intended. Instead of cleaning up toxins, the special collection days were making things worse. Ratche suggested the best way to avoid future disasters would be to make many more frequent toxic pickups, or create a dedicated drop-off site that the public could easily access as needed. An interesting Garbage Project aside, the trash from poorer neighborhoods could readily be identified by their hazardous materials, which were dominated by car care items, oils, and additives. The toxics most common to middle-class neighborhoods were weighted toward paints, stains, and varnishes. The substances related to home improvement, affluent, neighborhoods, apparently focused on lawn care, had toxic trash dominated by pesticides, fertilizers, and weed killers. The project developed a surprisingly accurate formula for calculating the relative income and demographics based on these kinds of trash distinctions. Ratche also noted that when sanitation departments provide larger trash cans to households, those households immediately begin to produce more trash. He calls this Parkinson's Law of Garbage. It's based on the original Parkinson's Law, formulated by British bureaucrat C. Northcote Parkinson, who in 1957 noted that work expands in order to fill whatever time is available for its completion. The trash version of this principle holds that garbage expands so as to fill the receptacles available for its containment. Ratche discovered this after researchers were perplexed by the fact that households in Phoenix threw away a third more trash than their counterparts in Tucson, despite the largely similar demographics, culture, and geography shared by the two cities. At the time, Phoenix collected its trash with mechanized garbage trucks and 90-gallon standard bins. Tucson had smaller trash receptacles. In 1988, Tucson switched to the same system Phoenix used, and the average amount of garbage produced, a figure that had barely budged for 15 years, suddenly went up by a third. The difference was made up by more yard wastes. Had they been composted or just left on the ground before? Old clothes? Had they been donated or given to others in the past? Household toxics, long accumulated in basements and garage, and recyclable plastics, glass and cans, previously bundled for separate collection, now quickly and easily dumped in the bigger bin. Parkinson's law suggested the need for separate mechanized bins for recyclables, which has since become the industry standard. Other garbage insights, large and small, emerged, and discarded birth control pill dispensers showed that a substantial minority of women were taking the pills incorrectly, missing and skipping days. The presence of condom wrappers in the trash rose 45% in the first 2 years after AIDS hit the news, suggesting that the public had taken seriously health admonitions to practice safe sex. And families in low-income neighborhoods tended to buy the smallest size packages of food, while the trash from affluent neighborhoods was rife with large and economy-sized products, which means the poor end up paying more money for packaging than food, while the food dollars of families with cash to spare go much further. The amount of alcohol consumed did not vary with phases of the moon, as legend has it, but drinking rates did increase considerably at certain times of the month, immediately after the paydays of major local employers. When finally, the Garbage Project issued a mild warning to romantics to rethink how they celebrate February 14, while almost no Halloween candy is ever thrown in. The trash only wrappers, a great deal of Valentine's Day candy never leaves the wrapper or box, and ends up at the dump instead. These sorts of insights, whether they suggested that serious policy changes were in order, or merely served as fascinating trivia, had a cumulative impact, the reputation of the Garbage Project, which began as something of an oddity that newspapers and local TV broadcasts delighted in treating tongue-in-cheek, and that initially was a source of embarrassment in the academic community, gradually was transformed. Yes, the word garbology may have originated as a sort of joke, first used in the 1960s by municipal dustmen in New Zealand and Britain to make their job titles sound loftier. But that began to change. The next edition of the Oxford English Dictionary defined garbology as Rathje did, the study of a community or culture by analyzing its wastes. Rathje's papers on trash were being accepted at major scientific journals. The Smithsonian Institution wanted to put together a garbology exhibit. This wasn't a joke after all. There was real science to be done here, and real revelations coming out of it. Then Hollywood got in on the act, having discovered one of Rathje's first garbage sorters, a student named Shelley Smith, who worked 6 semesters with the Garbage Project. Smith, now with the Past Foundation in Ohio, went on to an illustrious archaeological career of her own, including the 1982 excavation of a colonial sailing vessel from 1710 that was found 10 feet below the surface of Water Street in Manhattan's financial district, which, you guessed it, is in large measure built on landfill consisting mainly of 18th century garbage. Smith was invited to appear on a popular television game show called What's My Line, in which people with unusual careers attempted to stump a panel of celebrities. Smith won, having cleverly gotten a manicure and an orangey fake tan atop her real desert tan just before the show. The celebrity judges concluded that no one with nails that gorgeous could possibly be a professional garbage sorter. Next thing Rathje knew, representatives of the U.S. Census were on the horn, looking for help. They were having a terrible time trying to calculate the number of households in poor communities, and in particular, the number of 2-parent households. Census leaders were smarting at the revelation that they had a 40% margin of error when it came to determining whether or not there was a father present in inner city and immigrant neighborhoods. This, it turned out, was a crucial question, and not just as a matter of academic interest. These figures would determine all sorts of government policies, from the shape of state and federal voting districts to the amount of child welfare payments allocated, which is why the census was having trouble. Some residents feared being counted and losing benefits they relied on to live, to the budgeting and placement of social services for schools, daycare, single moms, and needy kids. 40% error rates just would not cut it. Could the Garbage Project help? Could Rathje's unusual insights into trash demographics be used to determine the age and gender of residents in a given neighborhood based on what they throw away? It turned out that they could. The Garbage Project had studied in detail the food and garbage patterns of 200 households for 5 weeks, painstakingly sorting and weighing all, their trash, then subtracting yard waste because it varied too much between urban, suburban, and rural locations, and so could skew the results. These households were active participants in the study, answering extensive questionnaires, so the Garbage Project knew the exact population, gender, and ages of all the family members involved. Rathje was then able to construct an equation: X households multiplied by Y residents equals Z pounds of garbage. As long as you knew the value of two of those numbers, you could figure out the third. The Garbage Project had produced what Rathje called the magic number to plug into a population equation. Multiplying that magic number by the number of households in a given neighborhood would tell you with surprising accuracy how many people lived there. This held true across geographic regions and income levels. Subsequent tests of the equation, according to Rathje, showed it had an accuracy of plus or minus 2.5%, which was better than the Census Bureau had managed in many areas of the country. Figuring out the second part, the census wanted, gender, turned out to be more difficult, however. This is because there are few distinctly male pieces of trash. Both men and women can use the same sorts of razors and shaving cream, for instance, and not even the presence of male. Figuring out the second part, the census wanted, gender, turned out to be more difficult, however. This is because there are few distinctly male pieces of trash. Both men and women can use the same sorts of razors and shaving cream, for instance, and not even the presence of male. Contraceptives would establish actual residency. Those items that are exclusively male or close enough, men's underwear, or cigar butts, for example, occur with such infrequency in the waste stream as to be useless as data points. The researchers got around this in the end by figuring out the markers for everyone but men. They developed equations for the number of infants' diaper counts, the number of children discarded toys, toy packaging, children's clothes in their packaging, and women discarded female hygiene products, cosmetics, and women's apparel, from which they could extrapolate the number of men from the total neighborhood population count. The mystery of the uncounted fathers residing in some neighborhoods could at last be solved, and the census could cure its chronic undercount. The plan was to apply this new technique in time for the 1990 census, but it never happened, Rathje laments. The then director of the census's Center for Survey Methods Research decided that it would be bad public relations to hire someone to analyze people's trash. They'd just have to live with the undercount. Nevertheless, this work showed a new and more powerful side of the Garbage Project, as it moved beyond simply sorting trash and into comparing its real-world footprint with the results of surveys and polls. It became very clear that trash provided potent, unique clues about the inner working of society and country that could be found nowhere else. It also began to show why trash was such a social, environmental, and fiscal problem. Most people had no idea what was really in their garbage, or for that matter, in their closets, refrigerators, cupboards, and shopping carts. The Garbage Project was tackling a big piece of the second question that must be answered in order to shrink the 102-ton legacy, namely why we are also so obviously clueless about the true size and nature of our waste. Rathje was exposing our trash mythology, what we know versus what we think we know about garbage. Rathje and his students soon documented how average Americans overestimated their intake of healthy foods, claiming, for example, to eat 3 times as much cottage cheese as they actually purchased based on the number of containers found in their garbage, and they vastly underestimated their less healthy eating habits. Potato chips, for instance, were reported to be eaten in quantities 81% smaller than the crumpled chip bags in the trash actually documented. Rathje calls this the lean cuisine syndrome. This kind of data is psychologically unsurprising, as most people chronically overestimate their good habits and underestimate the bad, but it also suggested that the focus groups and consumer preference surveys that so many business decisions are based on are practically worthless. Alcohol consumption was among the most dramatic deviations between survey and trash can, with a vast disparity between what people claimed to have imbibed and what the empties in the wastebasket indicated. About 3/4 of households reported 0 alcoholic beverage intake during a typical week, while 20% reported 7 or fewer beers consumed, with a handful owning up to drinking more than that. The trash reality check turned all this on its head. Only 1/4 of households had no evidence of alcohol in its week's worth of trash. Another quarter showed 1 to 7 beers consumed, and fully half the households had consumed 8 or more beers in a week. And this was after the garbage sorters excluded the debris from data skewing parties, discerned by the presence of soggy paper plates, large numbers of disposable cups, and the telltale presence of cigarette butts in partially empty beer bottles. Interestingly, while people tend to underestimate their own drinking by 40 to 60%, in households where one or more adults are teetotalers, they tend to be uncannily accurate in their estimates of the drinking habits of other family members, within an error rate of 10% or less. Rathje calls this the surrogate syndrome, although others have suggested town gossip complex might more accurately describe this phenomenon. As far as the type of alcoholic beverages consumed, the Garbage Project found a broad disparity across neighborhoods and income levels. The alcohol-related trash from low-income areas was dominated by beer bottles, with a smattering of hard liquor containers mixed in. Middle-income neighborhoods had booze-related trash that spanned the entire spectrum of spirits, beer, mostly in cans, wine and liquor. Upper-income households showed more expensive wine bottles than their middle-income counterparts, but somewhat less prestigious hard liquor brands. None of this is very surprising, Rathje says. But the interesting part is that 18 years of data show that the actual alcohol content delivered by these various beverage choices is consistent across all income groups. Regardless of income, Rathje says, everyone on average gets the same buzz on, trashy delusions. From a Garbage Project study for the U.S. Department of Agriculture on the lean cuisine syndrome, how people overestimate and underestimate their consumption of certain foods based on whether they are fattening or not. One day, after some 16 years of trash sorting and household consumer surveys, Rathje and a colleague were discussing the Garbage Project's latest findings. The other archaeologist heartily congratulated Rathje for all the fine work, but then made a pithy observation. That's great and all, but where's the dirt, Bill? If there's no dirt, it's not archaeology. Rathje was brought up short by this. His colleague was right. Archaeologists dig. If they wanted to do real archaeology, garbologists would have to dig too. Why hadn't he thought of this before? It was time to stop bringing the garbage home and start bringing their project to the garbage. Thus began years of plumbing the depths of landfills, 21 of them, all over the country, more than 100. And 30 tons pulled up by the bucket auger before Rathje finally called it quits after more than 30 years as the world's leading garbologist. The single most startling finding from Rathje's excavations was that garbage does not decompose inside landfills, as most people, including sanitation experts, believed. A well-maintained, airtight, dry sanitary landfill was more like a mummifier of trash than a decomposer of trash, Rathje found. 50-year-old newspaper was intact and readable. Headlines about President Truman's electoral chances still bold and black on the front page. Steaks and hot dogs came up intact after decades. But Kaiser rolls? Not so much. Exhumed, they looked remarkably like ancient, mossy granite grinding discs used to make prehistoric cornmeal. Then Rathje spotted the poppy seeds and realized he had not fallen through some weird trash time warp that put Stone Age tools in the same landfill stratum as bottle caps and an exhausted tube of hemorrhoid cream. Landfills, the Garbage Project diggers proved, were in many ways like giant time capsules, preserving for decades the seemingly perishable items we expected would turn to organic mush, while other items very, very slowly decomposed. There's enough decomposition to generate a steady flow of methane, but at a slow enough rate that organic waste remains recognizable for a long time. Grass clippings still, green after 15 years, onion peels and carrot tops hanging in there after 20. Which means that the methane flow can continue for a very long time too. According to Rathje, these findings, while unsettling to the orthodoxy, are a good thing. It means some of the potentially toxic juices people feared would leach out of landfills are basically just sitting there. This stability had long been recognized as the silver lining of plastic trash that we fail to recycle. It didn't decompose, and so posed no environmental hazard as long as it was contained in a landfill. On the other hand, the materials that people had hoped would biodegrade, even the stuff officially designated as, or specifically designed to be biodegradable, didn't break down as expected in landfills either. There was a good news finding on hazardous waste in municipal landfills too. The bad news, there was a lot more of it than anyone had believed. There were twice as many cans of bug spray, containers of paint, and old drain cleaner cans being slipped into trash bins and spirited off to landfills as had been believed. The good news, like so much other stuff in the landfill, it mostly just sat there. Even when the containers leaked or broke, the surrounding trash matrix soaked it up like a sponge and retained it. And a little more bad news, when there was a problem of landfill contamination leaking out into the real world, particularly after floods. This presence of chemical hazards could make residential trash just as toxic as industrial waste. The other dramatic finding from the landfill excavations, one that shocked even the jaded garbage sorters from Tucson who thought they had seen it all, was the amount of food waste dumped in landfills. As much as 17% of the garbage by weight that they were hauling up in the late 1990s and early 2000s consisted of food waste. Some of it was truly waste: coffee grounds, eggshells, plate-scraping slop, but nearly equal portions were completely edible. From expired hamburger to potato peels, a major and completely edible weight component of food waste, to those specialty breads, such as those deceptive Kaiser rolls, which ended up landfilled at far greater rates than standard loaves of bread, which were practically no-shows. Indeed, that finding led to the Garbage Project's first principle of food waste. The more repetitive your diet, the more you eat the same things day after day, the less food you waste. This principle upsets quite a few people and special interests, Rathje says. Nutritionists want a healthy variety. Food companies live and die by novelty, constantly introducing new breakfast cereal variations and reformulated baked goods and new flavors of processed food. But novelty, which consumers think they want more than they actually want, breeds waste. Those darn Kaiser rolls, along with hot dog buns and biscuits and English muffins, end up getting thrown out anywhere from 30 to 60% of the time. Novelty may make for effective marketing, but in terms of waste, it's a disaster. America's propensity for throwing away perfectly good food that could quite literally end hunger for millions of people has received considerable attention. Not reform recently, but the Garbage Project was calling attention to food waste as a vital issue 15 years ahead of the curve. We just thought it was appalling, Rathje recalls, and most people are oblivious to it. If you ask them, they'll tell you they are careful not to waste food, but as usual, their garbage tells a different story. It was typical for the households we looked at to waste 15% of the food they bought. A number of landfill excavations were made through contracts with cities that needed better insight into their trash. Unearthing garbage in Phoenix, the researchers were able to determine the amount of recyclables that were being buried. Aluminum cans alone could net the city more than $6 million a year if captured, recycled, and sold at market rates. The City Public Works Department used Rathje's analysis to pry $12 million from the Phoenix City Council to launch a new recycling program for the Arizona capital. After the Garbage Project informed the city of Toronto that construction waste was clogging a fifth of their available landfill space, the city invested in the infrastructure necessary to recycle concrete, bricks, and other demolition and construction debris. Excavations of 4 landfills in Toronto also validated the city's recycling program, one of the oldest in North America, which was under fire for costs. Rathje and his crew proved it was biting deeply into the waste stream and, if anything, had surpassed expectations. And in Mexico, the government adjusted its import taxes in favor of a bit of protectionism when the Garbage Project found that luxury goods purchased in Mexico City's affluent neighborhoods tended to be American-made. Rathje recalls an estimate made a few years back that suggested all of the garbage produced by the United States for the next 1,000 years could fit inside a single landfill, as long as said landfill stretched across 44 square miles and rose 120 feet high. That sounds huge, but not as huge as most people think. Such a landfill, less than a quarter the height of Puente Hills, would cover all of the Bronx, or a mere 1/5 of the West Coast Maine Marine Corps Base, Camp Pendleton, or just 0.36% of the land area of the state of New Mexico. More square miles of that state's national forests have burned in a single fire season than such a landfill would cover in 1,000 years. In other words, a 1,000-year landfill would be big, sure, but not really all that big. No one is proposing such a mega dump. The point is, Rathje says, we have plenty of room to keep burying our trash until we find a better plan. Space for trash, in other words, is not the problem. A far greater concern, as Rathje sees it, is the trash that doesn't get into the landfill vault. The debris in the gulches, the plastics in the ocean, the waste that drifts off into rivers and streams. And the biggest system flaw of all, he argues, is the disposable, wasteful mindset that creates the flow of trash in the first place. Rather than a problem specific to landfills or other sanitation strategies, he says, this is a flaw in how manufacturers create and consumers use disposable products. Now in his mid-60s, Rathje is retired from the garbology business and has turned to Buddhism and his passion for photography, illustrating Buddhist texts with his photos of nature. He sounds more than a little disappointed that the Garbage Project's heroic efforts to clear up mysteries and misunderstandings about waste have had so little impact in terms of changing things. We still waste colossal amounts of food. The EPA pegs food waste in landfills as more than 14% of total landfill contents by weight, which isn't much different from what Raytheon found more than a decade ago, despite recent attempts to ramp up composting nationwide. Most recyclable materials are not, in fact, recycled. It's frustrating, he says. The problem as he sees it is in how people define the very concept of waste, a question that is more philosophical than scientific. In modern garbage parlance, Rathje says, waste has become synonymous with trash. That is, waste has come to mean the perceived dirty, icky, unhealthful, useless, valueless material that's left over when we're done with something. By this definition, waste is the foul stuff we wish would just disappear. Our entire elaborate waste collection, transportation, and disposal system has for a century been built around this just make it go away concept, an illusion for which Americans happily, or at least regularly, pay either through taxes or monthly bills. Waste in this sort of discussion is always defined as a cost, a negative, and a burden, an inevitable, unpleasant fact of life for which the only remedy is removal. But what happens if a different definition of the word waste is emphasized? The original verb form of the word, as in to waste something. Now, the nature of the debate changes, because to waste implies the object being wasted has value, be it time, resources, or manpower. After all, you can't waste something devoid of value. If trash is defined not as waste, but as the physical manifestation of wastefulness, the discussion stops being about disposing of the dirty or useless, and starts being about asking why we're throwing away so much hard-earned money. Why are we wasting stuff that we pay for as product or packaging, then pay for again as trash to be hauled away? Now, it's no longer the waste itself that's negative, but the act of creating it that's at issue. And the convenience of burying these discarded items in landfills forever, or shipping them off to China to be recycled for pennies on the dollar, or far less, stops seeming so normal, so sensible. Rathje uses an archaeological analogy to express this distinction between waste and wastefulness. Boiled down to the most simple, broad categories, every great civilization goes through three main stages of evolution. First comes the pre-classic era, the florescent period, when a set of small, scrappy villages coalesces into something more powerful, a dramatically rising civilization that has learned how to make a living, be it through warfare, trade, irrigation, or some other method of consolidating and capitalizing on resources. Then, having reached a pinnacle of development, the civilization enters its classical period, in which it enjoys prosperity, steady growth, and dominance. The classic Maya culture that Rathje studied early in his career featured enormous temples and palaces sprawling across acres of verdant land, classical displays that required enormous resources and manpower to erect. A culture at that stage can afford extravagance. It can be, or at least believes itself to be, unharmed by waste. Eventually, either through competition from other cultures or simple exhaustion of available resources, a civilization, any civilization, enters an inevitable decline. This is the post-classic or decadent period. In ancient Maya, the temples of the decadent years became small, the palaces shrunk, the once treasure-laden tombs grew Spartan and poorly constructed. Cultures entering this terminal phase begin husbanding resources, recycling and repurposing like mad. This is the moment when conservation becomes the watchword, but the word always comes too late. Cultures replace extravagance with frugality only after the resources have dried up. Think Easter Island, the fall of Rome, and any number of empires, from Persian to Ottoman to Spanish to British. Always, the fall approaches and the wising up comes too late. One of the questions the Garbage Project sought to answer as it peered in the landfill mirror arose from that tragic history. What stage, Rathje asked, was American civilization in? Back in 2001, when Rathje penned an article on this subject for the surprisingly readable MSW Management, the Journal for Municipal Solid Waste Professionals, the answer seemed obvious. The conspicuous consumption, the outrageous levels of waste, the paltry recycling rates, the popularity of sport utility vehicles, the morbid obesity, the addiction to overpriced bottled water marked up thousands of times over its chemically identical tap water equivalent, all suggested in America in the midst of a most profligate classical period, embracing the culture of abundance, the illusion of the bottomless well. The headline on his column was Decadence Now. In it, Rathje urged what seemed at the time to be a premature embrace of the values of a decadent culture. America should break the historical pattern and commit to all-out conservation and husbanding of resources before, rather than after, it was too late. Time to swap those definitions of waste and wastefulness, Ratchi suggested, and hard as it might be. Start thinking about what happens during a product's end life before we even buy a damn thing. The heedless wastefulness that has been an American hallmark since the birth of the disposable economy has to come to an end. That will require an act of will, not unlike the decision by alcoholics or addicts to resist their insatiable cravings. That doesn't come easy, but that's what it takes, Ratchi says. Decadence now. There's just one problem. No great civilization of the past has ever pulled this off. None. Can we make a conscious, unprecedented decision to embrace the frugality, the source reduction, reuse, and recycling of the decadent period before it's too late, while we're still riding high in the classic period? Rashi wrote. Will we thereby extend our golden days? He wrote that 8 months before the 9/11 attacks. In the decade that followed, judging by the recession-induced shrinking of trash loads heading to landfills and the burgeoning interest in sustainability, recycling, and zero-waste strategies in communities across the country, it seems clear to Ratchi that we are right on the cusp of our own decadent period. Perhaps we've already slipped over, perhaps we'll pull back, he says. But that drop-off is coming up sooner or later, and probably sooner than anyone is quite ready to believe. Decadence now, he says again, then adds darkly, now or never.